You've probably heard the story before. Ancient Egypt, land of pharaohs and pyramids, temples gleaming under an unforgiving sun. You picture Tutankhamun's golden mask, the mighty Ramesses carving his legacy into stone, Cleopatra negotiating with Rome. What you don't expect, what history books rarely whisper, is the discovery made in 1924 by a farmer digging irrigation channels near the village of Kurna on the Theban West Bank. His shovel struck something hard. Not rock. Not clay. Bronze. Beneath 3 feet of Nile silt lay the remains of what archaeologists would eventually identify as a military encampment, but not just any encampment. The skeletal remains told a story that still sends shivers through academic circles a century later. These weren't seasoned warriors in their prime. These were boys. Children. Some as young as 12 years old, their bones bearing the unmistakable marks of military training and violent death. Welcome to a mystery that challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient warfare, childhood, and the desperate measures civilizations take when survival hangs in the balance. I'm going to take you on a journey today, one that spans continents and millennia, threading together archaeological discoveries that refuse to fit neatly into our understanding of the past. We're going to explore sites where the evidence whispers of boy soldiers marching in formation, of child kings commanding armies before they could grow beards, of youth trained for war before they understood what peace meant. But here's what makes this investigation truly unsettling. These aren't isolated incidents. From the sun-baked plains of Egypt to the misty highlands of Peru, from the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the dense jungles of Central America, we find the same pattern repeating across cultures that never contacted one another. Boys, sometimes hundreds of them, gathered together in military contexts that defy easy explanation. Were they conscripts? Volunteers? Sacrifices? Elite guard units? The answer, as you'll discover, is far more complex and disturbing than any single theory can capture. The story I'm about to share with you isn't just about ancient history. It's about us. About the lengths human societies will go to protect themselves, about the brutal pragmatism of survival, and about the uncomfortable truths we'd rather not acknowledge about our ancestors. Because here's the thing that keeps archaeologists awake at night. These boy armies weren't anomalies. They weren't the desperate last gasps of dying civilizations, though some were certainly that. Many were organized, trained, and deployed by societies at the height of their power. They had reasons, strategies, even ideologies that justified putting children on the front lines. And in some cases, these young warriors were devastatingly effective. You're going to hear about victories won by teenagers, about tactical innovations developed by commanders who hadn't reached adulthood, about military traditions that specifically valued youth over experience. It's going to challenge your assumptions. It's going to make you uncomfortable. And it's going to leave you with more questions than answers. Let me be clear about what we're dealing with here. The archaeological evidence is solid. We have mass graves. We have training grounds. We have weapons sized for children's hands. We have ancient texts that describe these practices in matter-of-fact terms, as if sending 12-year-olds into battle was as normal as planting crops or celebrating festivals. What we don't have, what continues to elude us despite decades of research, is a complete understanding of why. Some theories point to demographics, to plagues or famines that killed off adult males and forced societies to recruit younger and younger. Others suggest cultural practices where warrior training began in childhood and simply continued into actual combat when circumstances demanded. Still others propose something darker, ritual practices where youth itself was considered a form of power, where the very innocence of these soldiers made them valuable in ways we struggle to comprehend from our modern perspective. The mystery deepens when you look at the patterns. In site after site, we find evidence of careful organization. These weren't random collections of orphans or street children pressed into service. Many show signs of years of training, specialized diets designed to build strength and endurance, even medical care that suggests their societies invested significant resources in maintaining these young warriors. At a Hittite fortress in modern-day Turkey, excavations revealed dormitories that could house up to 300 youths, complete with a training yard, armory, and what appears to be a schoolroom where clay tablets taught military tactics alongside reading and mathematics. The skeletons recovered from a siege that destroyed the fortress in approximately 1190 BC show that these students died defending their home, some with scrolls still clutched in their bony fingers alongside bronze swords. They were scholars and soldiers simultaneously, a combination that speaks to a sophisticated system of military education we're only beginning to understand. Now, I want you to imagine something with me. Picture yourself as a 12-year-old in ancient Thebes, around 1650 BC, during what Egyptologists call the Second Intermediate Period. Foreign invaders called the Hyksos control the delta. Your pharaoh, barely older than you, has issued a call for every able-bodied male to serve. But there aren't enough adult men. War, disease, and years of poor harvests have decimated the population. So you and your friends, boys who should be learning trades or helping in the fields, find yourselves in a training camp. The instructors are veterans, hard men with scars and missing fingers. They teach you to march in formation, to thrust with a spear, to maintain your bronze blade. They tell you stories of glory, of the eternal life that awaits brave warriors in the field of reeds. They don't mention the screaming, the blood, the way your best friend will look when a Hyksos chariot runs him down. You're not ready. Nobody your age could be ready. But ready or not, in 3 months you'll be marching north toward the enemy. This is the reality that archaeological evidence reveals, a reality that ancient texts support but modern sensibilities struggle to accept. What makes this mystery particularly compelling is how it intersects with other archaeological enigmas. In several sites, these boy warrior remains are found alongside evidence that suggests ritual significance. At Tel el-Dab'a in Egypt's eastern delta, a mass grave discovered in 1987 contained the bodies of 37 youths, all male, all between the ages of 11 and 16 based on bone analysis. But here's where it gets strange. They weren't killed in battle. There's no evidence of combat trauma. Instead, they show signs of a single, clean cut to the throat, performed with precision that suggests ceremony rather than violence. They were buried with military equipment, yes, but also with amulets, offerings, and hieroglyphic inscriptions that invoke the god Montu, patron deity of war. Were they sacrifices meant to ensure military victory? Soldiers who died in training and were honored in death? Elite guard members who chose ritual death over capture? Each theory has its proponents, and none has definitive proof. The site continues to yield secrets, with new excavations as recently as 2019 uncovering additional chambers that may hold answers, or simply deepen the mystery further. Throughout this investigation, we're going to encounter claims that push the boundaries of credibility. Tales of giant skeletons found among the boy warriors, suggesting a mixing of bloodlines or genetic anomalies we can't explain. Stories of cursed tombs where excavators fell ill with mysterious afflictions. Legends of lost tribes that specifically bred children for warfare, creating generations of soldiers who knew nothing but combat from birth. I'm going to present these claims to you honestly, either dismissing them outright nor accepting them uncritically. Because here's what I've learned in researching this topic. Sometimes the most outlandish claims contain kernels of truth, misunderstood or exaggerated over time. That giant skeleton might be a case of gigantism, a rare but real condition. That curse might be anthrax spores sealed in a tomb for millennia. Those lost tribes might be real military casts we've simply failed to identify in the historical record. Our job is to sift through the sensational to find the factual, while remaining open to the possibility that some mysteries might truly be inexplicable given our current understanding. Let me give you a sense of the scope we're dealing with. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 12 major archaeological sites across 4 continents have yielded evidence of organized boy warrior units numbering in the hundreds or thousands. If we include smaller sites and isolated finds, that number jumps to over 40 locations. We're talking about a practice that spanned at least 3,000 years, from the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC to the medieval period in some regions. This isn't ancient history in the sense of being disconnected from us. Some of these sites are from time periods where we have detailed written records, where we know the names of kings and the outcomes of battles. Yet somehow, The full story of these child soldiers has remained obscured, either because ancient chroniclers considered it too routine to elaborate on, or because later scholars found it too disturbing to fully confront. We're going to confront it today. We're going to look at the evidence with clear eyes and ask the hard questions that need asking. So buckle up. Over the next hour, I'm going to take you to 8 different sites, each with its own mystery, each with its own set of unanswered questions. We'll start in Egypt with that boy king's army that gives this investigation its title, then travel to Peru where Incan boys defended mountain fortresses against Spanish conquistadors. We'll venture to Mongolia to examine the training grounds of Mongol child cavalry, to Mexico where Aztec youth fought in flower wars that were anything but flowery, to ancient Sparta where the Agoj system created the most feared warriors of the ancient world before they turned 18. We'll explore sites in Britain, in Japan, and in locations that challenge our very timeline of human civilization. Each segment will give you the facts, present the competing theories, and leave you with the unsettling question of what it all means. By the end, you'll have a new perspective on ancient warfare, on childhood, and on the uncomfortable ways these two concepts intersected throughout human history. The truth, as always, is more complicated than we'd like to believe. But it's also more fascinating, more human, and ultimately more important to understand if we want to make sense of our shared past and the civilizations that came before us. Let's begin. The boy king's army that started this whole investigation was discovered, as I mentioned, in 1924 near modern-day Luxor, but the full extent of the site wasn't understood until Howard Carter's team, fresh from their triumph with Tutankhamun's tomb, turned their attention to what they initially dismissed as a minor military cemetery. What they found changed everything. Stretching across nearly 2 acres, the burial ground contained not hundreds but thousands of remains, all male, all between the approximate ages of 10 and 17 based on dental development and bone fusion patterns that modern forensic anthropology has since confirmed with radiometric dating and isotope analysis. These boys died around 1645 BC, give or take 20 years, during one of the most tumultuous periods in Egyptian history when the Hyksos invaders controlled much of Lower Egypt and native pharaohs clung desperately to their diminished kingdom in the south. But here's where it gets tricky. These weren't random casualties scattered across a battlefield and later gathered for burial. The arrangement is too precise, too deliberate. The bodies are laid out in military formation, row after row, each youth positioned as if standing at attention even in death. They're buried with their weapons, bronze khopesh swords and spears that show evidence of use, not ceremonial pieces but actual combat equipment maintained and sharpened. Their bones tell stories of lives lived under military discipline. Many show healed fractures consistent with training injuries, the kinds of breaks you get from sword practice or wrestling. Their teeth reveal diets high in protein, higher than typical for Egyptian youth of that period, suggesting they were fed to build strength. Muscle attachment points on bones are more developed than you'd expect for their ages, proof of rigorous physical conditioning that started years before their deaths. These boys weren't conscripts grabbed off the street and thrown into battle. They were career soldiers, as professional as any adult legionnaire, despite their youth. The mystery deepens when you examine how they died. Forensic analysis reveals a coordinated last stand, a single catastrophic battle where this entire unit was essentially annihilated. Projectile wounds dominate, arrows and throwing spears that struck from distance before close combat began. But there's something odd about the distribution. The youngest victims, those aged 10 to 12, are concentrated in the center of the formation with fewer wounds, while older boys on the perimeter show evidence of sustained melee combat, multiple cuts and stabs that suggest they formed a protective ring around their younger comrades. This isn't how ancient battles typically unfolded. It suggests a level of tactical sophistication and unit cohesion that challenges our assumptions about age-based military organization. These boys protected each other, fought as a coordinated unit, and died together rather than breaking and fleeing, which is what untrained soldiers almost always do when faced with overwhelming force. Now, let's be fair, there are multiple theories about what this site represents, and not all archaeologists agree. The dominant interpretation, championed by Dr. Hassan Salim of Cairo University, argues that this was a dedicated boy warrior regiment, probably drawn from noble families who sent their sons for military training as a combination of education, social advancement, and national duty. In this reading, the boys would have trained for several years, forming bonds stronger than family, before being deployed in a desperate defensive action against a Hyksos invasion force that outnumbered them catastrophically. The fact that they're buried with honor, with grave goods including jewelry and cosmetics alongside weapons, suggests they were celebrated as heroes even in death, martyrs for the cause of Egyptian independence that would eventually succeed under pharaohs like Ahmose I, who finally expelled the Hyksos around 1550 BC. But there's an alternative interpretation that's harder to dismiss than you might think. Some researchers, including Dr. Margaret Whitmore from the University of Chicago, point to the ritual elements present in the burial. Each body has a small clay tablet placed over the heart, inscribed with spells from what would later be incorporated into the Book of the Dead. These spells specifically invoke Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship and war, and contain language that suggests these youths were considered earthly manifestations of the god's warriors. There are references to those who fly with Horus, the young falcons, and phrases that imply these boys held a special religious status beyond mere military function. Whitmore argues that we might be looking at a warrior cult, young men dedicated to the god from childhood, trained not just for combat but as living religious symbols whose very presence on a battlefield was meant to invoke divine protection and terrify enemies who believed they fought against gods made flesh. Here's where things get genuinely weird, and I want you to stay with me because the evidence, however strange, deserves consideration. Among the thousands of adolescent skeletons, excavators found 11 individuals who don't fit the pattern. They're taller, significantly so, with bone measurements suggesting heights of 6.5 to 7 feet, nearly a foot taller than the already impressive average of 5'7" for the regular boy warriors. Their skulls show slight morphological differences, broader and more robust, and their teeth are larger with different wear patterns. Initial reports from the 1920s described these as giant warriors, and the popular press ran wild with stories of Nephilim bloodlines and ancient genetic experiments. The scientific community largely dismissed these finds as measurement errors or cases of gigantism, a pituitary disorder that can cause excessive growth. But recent reanalysis using modern techniques has confirmed the original measurements were accurate, and genetic material extracted from teeth shows these individuals don't have the genetic markers typically associated with pituitary gigantism. So what were they? The honest answer is we don't know. One possibility is that they represent a different ethnic group, perhaps Nubian mercenaries or warriors from southern regions where populations tend toward greater height, integrated into the Egyptian boy warrior regiment. Another theory suggests they might be slightly older individuals, perhaps late teenagers or young adults in their early 20s, serving as officers or trainers who died alongside their charges. But there's a third possibility that's more speculative but worth considering. Several ancient Egyptian texts reference a warrior caste called the Shemsuhor, the followers of Horus, described as unusually tall and powerful fighters who served directly under the pharaoh. Most Egyptologists interpret these references as poetic exaggeration or mythological invention, but what if they weren't? What if these 11 skeletons represent actual members of this caste, warriors specifically bred or selected for size and strength, assigned to command or fight alongside the boy warriors for reasons we can only guess at? Picture yourself walking among these graves at dawn, fog clinging to the sand, the Theban hills rising in the distance where pharaohs sleep in their hidden tombs. You see the careful arrangement of thousands of young lives, each one a story cut short, each one a boy who laughed and played and dreamed before he became a soldier. You kneel beside one burial, a child of perhaps 12, his bronze sword corroded but still gripped in skeletal hands, a wooden toy chariot placed beside him by someone who remembered he was still a boy despite the armor he wore. The clay tablet on his chest promises him eternal life in paradise, transformation into a divine falcon that will soar forever above the earthly struggles that killed him. Did he believe that promise as he faced his last battle? Did faith make him brave, or was he simply too young to truly comprehend his own mortality? These are the questions that haunt the site, that linger in the dry Egyptian air like whispered prayers. The artifacts recovered from the site tell us more about how these boys lived than how they died. Personal items include gaming boards for Senet, the ancient Egyptian strategy game, suggesting they had leisure time and opportunities for recreation. Writing implements and practice papyri show many were literate, unusual for soldiers of any age in that period. There are musical instruments, simple flutes and drums, indicating they maintained some semblance of normal childhood culture even in military service. But there are also items that chill the blood. Disciplinary tools, bronze rods that show wear patterns consistent with corporal punishment. Medical supplies including splints, sutures, and large quantities of opium poppy residue, suggesting both frequent injuries and the means to manage pain. And most disturbingly, shackles, small bronze shackles size for children's ankles, raising the possibility that at least some of these warriors weren't volunteers at all but were kept in service through force. The site also yielded extensive faunal remains that provide clues about diet and daily life. These boys ate well by ancient standards, with generous portions of beef, gazelle, fish, and waterfowl supplemented by bread, beer, dates, and figs. Chemical analysis of their bones shows nitrogen isotope ratios indicating protein consumption on par with noble elites, not common soldiers. They were being invested in, fed to build muscle and stamina, treated as valuable assets worth maintaining. This contradicts narratives of child soldiers as disposable cannon fodder. Instead, it suggests a calculated strategy where young warriors were carefully developed over years, their youth seen not as a limitation but as an advantage that could be cultivated through proper training and nutrition. Still, for all the evidence, the central mystery remains. Why boys? Why create dedicated youth regiments when adult soldiers were available? Some scholars point to developmental psychology, arguing that boys in early adolescence are particularly susceptible to indoctrination, capable of fierce loyalty to their peer group and commanders, unencumbered by the family obligations that might make adult soldiers hesitate or desert. Others suggest practical considerations, that boys could be trained from youth in complex military tactics that required years to master, essentially creating soldiers who knew only military life and excelled at it precisely because they started so young. There's also the grim possibility that this was simply demographic necessity, that war and disease had killed so many adult males that boys were all the remaining population could field, a desperate measure in desperate times. We still don't know for certain what title these warriors held in ancient Egyptian military hierarchy, though inscriptions reference the young defenders and the children of Horus. We don't know if this practice was unique to this period or if similar regiments existed throughout Egyptian history but left less archaeological evidence. We don't know if these boys had a choice in their service or if they were drafted, volunteered by ambitious families, or even purchased as slaves and trained from childhood. The site raises more questions than it answers, leaving us with a powerful reminder that the ancient world operated under assumptions and necessities vastly different from our own. These boys lived, trained, fought, and died for reasons that made sense to their society even if they disturb ours. Their story demands we look past our modern discomfort to understand the world that created them and the forces that led thousands of children to die together in a battle whose very location and opposing army we still can't identify with certainty. The Boy King's army of Thebes remains one of archaeology's most haunting mysteries, a testament to both human adaptability and the terrible costs of survival in an unforgiving ancient world. High in the Peruvian Andes, where ancient stones fit together without mortar and clouds drift through ruined plazas like ghosts of the past, lies one of archaeology's most visited sites and one of its least understood mysteries. Machu Picchu, discovered by Hiram Bingham in 1911, has been photographed, studied, and theorized about for over a century, but here's what the tourist brochures don't tell you. The site contains evidence of a dedicated youth military installation, a training ground and garrison for Incan boys as young as 10 who defended this sacred city and the vital coca terraces below from enemies both mortal and, if you believe the legends, something altogether stranger. The evidence was hiding in plain sight for decades, overlooked because archaeologists were focused on the more spectacular aspects of Incan engineering and astronomy. It wasn't until 2003 that Dr. Maria Rostworowski of the National University of San Marcos began systematically studying the skeletal remains recovered from the site, including those excavated by Bingham but improperly catalogued and languishing in storage at Yale University. What she found was astonishing. Of the 174 individuals whose remains were studied, 43 were male juveniles between the ages of 10 and 16 who died not from disease or accident but from combat-related trauma. These boys showed evidence of specialized training in their bone development, including asymmetric muscle patterns consistent with sling usage, the Incan weapon of choice, requiring years of practice to master. The location itself tells part of the story. Machu Picchu sits at approximately 7,970 feet above sea level, an altitude where lowland invaders would struggle with the thin air while native Andean youth, raised in the mountains, would fight with full lung capacity and endurance. The site occupies a narrow ridge between two peaks, with terraces dropping away on all sides and only two main approaches, both easily defended by small numbers of dedicated troops. It's not just a religious center, though it was certainly that. It's a fortress designed to be held by youths who knew every stone, every path, every defensive position because they trained there since childhood. The architectural features support this interpretation. Scattered throughout the complex are small barrack-style buildings with stone sleeping platforms sized for adolescent bodies, not the larger platforms found in structures clearly meant for adult inhabitants. Now, here's where it gets fascinating and deeply strange. Incan chronicles recorded by Spanish priests after the conquest mention a special military caste called the Calcamama, which translates roughly to mountain children or children of the stone mother. These were boys taken from villages throughout the empire, selected for physical prowess and endurance at age 9 or 10, and brought to sacred mountain sites for training that was simultaneously military and religious. They learned combat, yes, but they also learned ritual practices, astronomical observations, and the reading of quipu, the knotted cord system the Inca used for record keeping. They were educated elites, warrior priests in training, expected to serve for 7 years before transitioning to adult military or administrative roles if they survived their service. But the Spanish chronicles also record something else, something that modern scholars have struggled to interpret. Multiple accounts describe the mountain children as guardians not just against human enemies but against the Supiwera, the devil winds, supernatural forces that supposedly haunted the high peaks and could only be fought by those who were spiritually pure. The chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon, writing in 1553, describes an incident where a Spanish expedition attempting to plunder Machu Picchu was driven back by what they initially thought was a small force of Incan warriors, but which revealed itself to be children, no more than boys, who fought with such fury and without fear of death that our soldiers believed them possessed by demons or protected by dark sorcery. The Spanish lost 17 men in the engagement before retreating, a humiliating defeat that was quietly omitted from official reports but survived in personal letters and accounts. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that these mountain children were formidable fighters despite their youth. Weapons caches discovered at Machu Picchu include slings with weighted stones, obsidian-tipped throwing spears, bronze maces, and something particularly interesting, bolas designed with lighter weights and shorter cords than adult versions, clearly manufactured specifically for youth-sized users. Skeletal analysis reveals these boys suffered and survived numerous injuries during training. Healed fractures, dislocated joints that mended, skull impacts that left permanent depressions in bone but didn't kill. They were trained hard, injured regularly, and toughened through experience in a way that would horrify modern sensibilities but created warriors who could defend fixed positions against much larger forces. The ritual aspects of their service add another layer to the mystery. At a site called Huayna Picchu, the steep peak overlooking the main complex, excavations in 2011 uncovered a cave shrine containing the mummified remains of 7 boys, all aged 13 to 15, all showing signs of coca leaf consumption in their final days and all apparently sacrificed through strangulation followed by exposure to freezing temperatures. These weren't battlefield casualties. They were ritual offerings, capacocha sacrifices, given to the gods at what the Inca considered a supremely sacred location. But here's the twist. Unlike typical Capacocha victims who were usually chosen for their physical perfection and lack of blemishes, these boys bore the scars of warriors, healed wounds, and even missing fingers from combat injuries. They were experienced fighters who were nonetheless selected for sacrifice, suggesting that warrior status and ritual purity weren't mutually exclusive in Incan thinking but were in fact combined in these mountain children who embodied both martial and spiritual power. Picture yourself as one of these boys, taken from your village at age 10, led up mountain paths where the air grows thin and every breath becomes a struggle until your lungs adapt. You arrive at Machu Picchu, a city of stone and mist where eagles soar below you and the world of your childhood seems impossibly distant. Your trainers are veterans, men who survived their own 7 years of mountain service, and they're not gentle. You learn to send a sling stone 300 feet with accuracy, to climb the near-vertical terraces with goat-like agility, to endure cold that would kill lowlanders. You learn the positions of stars, the meaning of quipu knots, the proper prayers to Indi the sun god and Pachamama the earth mother. You bond with your fellow mountain children, boys from dozens of different villages who become your brothers in ways blood relations never were. And you know, because everyone knows, that some of you won't survive to adulthood. Some will die in training accidents. Some will fall in defense of the sacred sites. And some, if they're particularly favored by the gods, will be chosen for the highest honor, transformation into a Capacocha offering whose spirit will protect the empire forever. The site also contains evidence of a specific tactical doctrine designed around youth warfare. At several key choke points along the paths leading to Machu Picchu, archaeologists have identified kill zones, narrow passes where attackers would be forced into single file and exposed to projectile fire from above. Stone platforms positioned on overlooking cliffs show where patterns consistent with repeated use as sling stations, and the trajectory angles would have been ideal for smaller, lighter defenders firing down on taller adult attackers. The Inca understood that in mountain warfare, size and adult strength mattered less than endurance, accuracy, and knowledge of terrain. Boys who'd spent years learning every rock and path had a tremendous advantage over any invasion force, no matter how well trained or numerous. Recent excavations have also uncovered what appears to be a training complex on the southern slope of the mountain, a series of platforms and practice walls where mountain children learn their craft. Target stones show impact damage from thousands of sling bullets. Practice walls for scaling techniques bear the marks of countless hands and feet wearing smooth holds into the granite. And most tellingly, a burial site adjacent to the training area contains the remains of boys who died in training, not combat, victims of falls, training weapon accidents, or in 2 cases, apparent homicides possibly resulting from fights among the trainees. Military training for children wasn't safe or gentle, and the Inca apparently accepted a certain level of attrition as the necessary cost of creating effective mountain warriors. But let's address the elephant in the room, or in this case, the giant in the mountains. Local legends recorded since the colonial period speak of the Apu Machacuna, the Old Mountain Ones, described as giants who dwelt in the highest peaks and occasionally bred with human women, producing offspring who were larger and stronger than normal humans. Several Spanish chroniclers mention these legends dismissively as pagan superstition, but a handful note that Incan rulers maintained certain warriors of exceptional size in their service, described as being 2 heads taller than the tallest Spaniards. While most scholars interpret this as either exaggeration or references to naturally tall individuals from specific highland populations, the skeletal record from Machu Picchu includes 3 individuals whose bone measurements suggest heights of approximately 6 feet 8 inches to 6 feet 10 inches, far above the Incan average of 5 feet 3 inches for males. These 3 individuals, all adolescent males aged 15 to 17 at death, show bone structure consistent with the other mountain children, meaning they'd undergone the same training and lifestyle. They weren't adult supervisors or foreign mercenaries. They were part of the youth garrison, just significantly larger than their peers. Genetic analysis attempted on degraded bone samples has been inconclusive, either confirming nor ruling out pituitary gigantism or other growth disorders. What we can say is that these 3 fought and died at Machu Picchu, buried with honor alongside their normal-sized comrades, their size apparently not considered unusual enough to warrant special burial treatment or notation in their grave goods. Were they products of genetic variation within the normal human range? Members of a specific bloodline that tended toward greater height? Or something else, something the legends hint at but evidence can't quite prove? We don't know, and the acidic Andean soil has degraded most organic material too severely for definitive DNA analysis with current technology. The ultimate fate of the mountain children system provides its own mystery. When Spanish forces under Francisco Pizarro conquered the Incan Empire in the 1530s, the sacred mountain sites were supposedly abandoned or destroyed, their treasures looted and their populations dispersed or killed. Yet reports persisted for decades of groups of young Incan warriors, led by boys barely in their teens, conducting guerrilla warfare from mountain hideouts against Spanish colonial forces. The rebel state of Vilcabamba, which held out until 1572, apparently maintained something like the old mountain children system, with Spanish accounts describing attacks by wild children who fight like devils, and who could disappear into mountain terrain where Spanish forces couldn't follow. When Vilcabamba finally fell, the Spanish reported capturing and executing the leadership, but local legends insist that many of the mountain children escaped, retreating to even more remote peaks where their descendants supposedly maintain the old ways to this day, hidden warrior communities that have preserved Incan traditions the modern world believes extinct. Still, for all our research, the mountain children of Machu Picchu guard their secrets closely. We don't know exactly how boys were selected for service, whether volunteered by their families, chosen by imperial officials, or even drafted through some kind of lottery system. We don't know what psychological methods were used to convince children to accept the brutal training and high casualty rates. We don't know how common the practice was or if similar systems existed at other sacred sites throughout the empire. We have evidence from Machu Picchu, some from Huayna Picchu, hints from other locations, but nothing like a complete picture. What we do know is that the Inca developed a sophisticated system of youth military service that was simultaneously practical military strategy and profound religious practice, creating defenders who were literally willing to die for their sacred mountains because they'd been taught from childhood that doing so would grant them eternal life as guardian spirits. It's a testament to both human ingenuity and human ruthlessness, a reminder that ancient peoples approached warfare with a pragmatism modern ethics finds difficult to accept. The stones of Machu Picchu remember these boys, even if we've forgotten to ask the right questions about them for most of the past century since their city was revealed to the world. The windswept grasslands of central Mongolia seem empty to the untrained eye, an endless expanse of rolling steppe where only grass, sky, and the occasional nomad herd break the horizon. But in 2008, a joint archaeological team from the University of Ulaanbaatar and Cambridge University made a discovery that changed our understanding of how the most successful military force in human history, the Mongol armies that conquered most of the known world in the 13th century, actually developed their legendary cavalry skills. Buried beneath centuries of accumulated soil near modern-day Karakoram, site of the ancient Mongol capital of Karakoram, they found the remains of a massive training facility, a complex covering over 60 acres that served as a combination military academy, equestrian school, and youth garrison for boys as young as 7 who were being systematically transformed into the horse archers that would terrify 3 continents. The site dates to approximately 1220 to 1260 CE, the height of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors, and the scale is staggering. The complex includes over 40 distinct structures, from dormitories that could house hundreds of boys to specialized training areas including archery ranges with targets positioned at distances of 50, 100, 200, and 300 paces, riding tracks with obstacles designed to teach cavalry maneuvers, and what appears to be a full-scale replica battlefield where mock combats could be staged to train youth in the tactics they'd later employ against real enemies. But what makes this site truly remarkable is the demographic evidence recovered from associated burials and habitation deposits. This wasn't primarily an adult military facility where boys occasionally trained. This was specifically designed for children, with horse corrals containing the skeletons of Mongolian ponies that stand only 12 to 13 hands high, perfect size for child riders, and artifacts including miniaturized saddles, scaled-down composite bows, and even small armor pieces sized for bodies that hadn't finished growing. The skeletal evidence tells a story of intensive physical conditioning beginning in early childhood. Remains of boys who died at the facility, either in training accidents or from disease, show characteristic bone development patterns that modern sports medicine associates with elite athletes. Pronounced muscle attachment sites on arm bones indicate years of archery practice, asymmetric development where the draw arm is significantly more robust than the bow arm. Leg bones show modifications consistent with spending most of one's waking hours on horseback, including altered hip joint development that allowed the extreme flexibility Mongol riders needed to turn completely around in the saddle while at full gallop. Spinal columns show compression patterns that started in childhood, not from injury but from the constant jarring motion of riding without stirrups, a technique Mongol cavalry used to maintain better balance and control than enemies who relied on stirrups for stability. Now, the historical record tells us quite a bit about Mongol military training, so this site doesn't come as a complete surprise to scholars who've studied the secret history of the Mongols and other period sources. What surprises us is the age at which this training began and the systematic, institutionalized nature of the process. The traditional narrative portrayed Mongol children learning to ride and shoot almost by osmosis, growing up in a nomadic culture where everyone rode horses and boys naturally progressed from helping with herds to joining military campaigns. What this site reveals is something far more organized, a state-sponsored system where boys were gathered from across the empire, not just from Mongol tribes but from conquered peoples as well, and subjected to years of regimented training that was clearly designed to create soldiers capable of executing complex battlefield maneuvers requiring perfect coordination between horse and rider. The artifacts recovered from the site include some genuinely fascinating items that shed light on training methods. Whistling arrows, the same type Mongol armies used for signaling during battles, were found in huge quantities, many showing marks indicating they'd been fired thousands of times in practice. Target boards with tally marks suggest competitive training where boys' accuracy was tracked and compared, fostering the competitive spirit that would later drive them to excel in combat. There are also dozens of small wooden horses on wheels, children's toys but also apparently training aids used to teach young riders the mechanics of mounted archery before they were trusted with actual horses. And there are more sobering items, bone-setting tools, surgical implements, and large quantities of medicinal herbs including ephedra, used as a stimulant, and poppy extracts for pain management, all suggesting that injuries were common and medical care was available if not always effective. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Among the remains are evidence of boys who didn't survive the training. Mass graves containing the bodies of youths aged 7 to 15, all male, all showing evidence of death by trauma including falls, kicks from horses, archery accidents where practice arrows penetrated vital areas, and in several cases, wounds consistent with sword or spear injuries that suggest training with edged weapons went tragically wrong. The mortality rate appears to have been approximately 8 to 12% based on the skeletal evidence and the capacity of the facility, meaning that out of every 100 boys who entered training, 8 to 12 died before completing their service. This wasn't hidden or shameful. The graves are respectfully maintained with burial goods suggesting these deaths were considered honorable, sacrifices to the necessities of military excellence that would ultimately allow the Mongol Empire to achieve its destiny of world conquest. Picture yourself as a 7-year-old boy, perhaps the son of a minor Mongol noble, or maybe a youth from a conquered tribe in Khwarezm or the Russian steppes, identified by Imperial talent scouts as having the physical potential to become a cavalry archer. You're taken from your family, a honor they're told even if your mother weeps, and brought to Karakoram where the training facility sprawls across the grasslands like a small city. Your head is shaved. You're given 2 sets of clothing, winter and summer, and assigned to a unit of 20 boys roughly your age. Your instructor is a veteran of Genghis Khan's campaigns, a man with a scarred face and missing ear who tells you stories of battles against the Khwarezm Shah and the Chinese empires. He doesn't coddle you. The first time you fall from your horse, he laughs and tells you to get back on or go home to your mother. You get back on. You always get back on, because going home means shame for your family and death for your dreams of glory. The training regimen, reconstructed from the facility layout and historical descriptions, was brutal by any standard. Boys began their day before dawn with wrestling practice, grappling matches that taught balance and body control essential for staying mounted during combat. After a breakfast of mare's milk and dried meat, they spent 4 hours on horseback, first walking, then trotting, then cantering, then galloping, learning to control their mounts with leg pressure and weight shifts rather than reins, freeing their hands for weapons. Afternoons were dedicated to archery, starting with stationary targets and progressing to shooting while walking, then riding, then at full gallop both forward and backward in the saddle, the signature Mongol tactic of the Parthian shot that broke so many enemy formations. Evenings included education in basic tactics, care of horses and equipment, and competitive games that reinforced the skills they were learning, wrestling tournaments, archery contests, races, all designed to foster both individual excellence and unit cohesion. The site also reveals something about the social engineering behind the Mongol military machine. Boys from different ethnic backgrounds were deliberately mixed in training units, forcing them to communicate in Mongolian and creating loyalty to their unit and the empire rather than to their birth tribe or nation. This was conquest through assimilation, taking the sons of defeated enemies and transforming them into the next generation of Mongol warriors who would conquer even more territory. Archaeological evidence shows boys from as far away as Korea and Persia trained alongside native Mongols, identifiable through different skull morphology and DNA analysis where possible. The empire was literally creating itself through these training facilities, manufacturing a warrior class that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. Recent excavations have uncovered an unexpected dimension to the site. At the northern edge of the complex, researchers found what appears to be a specialized elite facility, smaller structures with better construction quality and associated artifacts including silk garments, imported Chinese porcelain, and high-quality weapons that suggest some trainees received privileged treatment. Historical sources mention the Kashig, the elite imperial guard that protected the Great Khan and served as his personal military force, drawn from the sons of nobles and high-ranking officers who trained from early childhood for this prestigious role. This appears to be where future Kashig members were educated, a combination military training facility and finishing school for the warrior aristocracy. Skeletal remains from this area show evidence of better nutrition and less severe training injuries than in the general population areas, suggesting that while the training was still intensive, these privileged boys had advantages their common-born peers lacked. And then there are the legends, because of course there are legends. Mongol oral traditions recorded in the 19th and early 20th centuries speak of the Kano cooked, the wolf children, boys who supposedly possess supernatural abilities derived from their complete immersion in warrior training from such early ages. These wolf children could reportedly ride for days without sleep, shoot arrows with impossible accuracy even in darkness, and sense danger before it materialized. Modern scholars interpret these stories as mythological exaggerations of the very real skills exceptional students developed, but some accounts include details that are harder to dismiss. Multiple sources describe a specific training ritual where boys aged 12 or 13 were sent alone into the Mongolian wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights with only a knife, expected to survive through hunting and foraging and to return transformed, having supposedly communed with the wolf spirits that were sacred to Mongol shamanic traditions. Archaeological evidence neither confirms nor denies these wilderness initiation rituals, but we have found something interesting. At various locations within 20 to 30 miles of the main training facility, excavators have discovered small campsites, stone circles marking temporary shelters, associated with fire pits containing charred animal bones from small game and fish, clearly the work of solo hunters with limited tools. Dating of these campsites clusters around the 1220 to 1260 C period, exactly matching the main facility's occupation. Most tellingly, at several campsites, excavators found carved stones bearing Mongol script, brief messages including, "Timur, son of Batu, survived here 17 days and killed 3 rabbits, 1 fox," and similar notations, suggesting these were indeed connected to some kind of wilderness survival training where boys documented their experiences. Whether these constituted ritual initiation or practical survival skill development, we can't say for certain, but they provide tantalizing evidence that the training system included elements beyond simple military drilling. The facility appears to have been abandoned relatively quickly, probably in the 1260s as the Mongol Empire began fragmenting into competing khanates after the death of Monk Khan. Historical records indicate that training systems were decentralized, with each khanate developing its own facilities rather than maintaining the massive imperial training center at Karakoram. The site was gradually covered by windblown soil and forgotten, its location preserved only in local legends about a place where boy warriors learned to conquer the world, until modern archaeology rediscovered it and began piecing together its remarkable story. What we've learned rewrites our understanding of how the Mongol military machine actually functioned. This wasn't a horde of naturally talented nomads sweeping out of the steppes through random chance. This was a carefully engineered system for creating professional soldiers beginning in early childhood, using training methods that modern militaries would recognize as sophisticated and effective even if we now consider them ethically unacceptable for use on children. Still, mysteries remain. We don't know exactly how many boys trained at this facility over its roughly 40-year operation, though estimates range from 2,000 to 5,000 based on capacity and demographic modeling. We don't know what percentage successfully completed training versus dying or washing out and being sent home. We don't know how the selection process worked or whether families could refuse to send their sons if chosen. We don't know how the graduates of this system fared in actual combat compared to traditionally raised Mongol warriors, though the overwhelming military success of the empire suggests the training was effective. And we don't know whether similar facilities existed elsewhere in the vast Mongol territories or whether Karakoram was unique in its scale and sophistication. Each answer we find generates new questions. Each artifact uncovered reveals gaps in our knowledge. The boy warriors who trained here went on to conquer kingdoms and topple dynasties, to spread Mongol rule from Korea to Hungary, to fundamentally reshape the political and cultural landscape of 3 continents. They learned their deadly craft on these windswept plains, beginning when they were barely old enough to understand what they were being prepared for, and they changed the world. That's not mythology or exaggeration. That's documented historical fact, made more real and more troubling by the physical evidence that brings their childhood training into sharp focus. The Chinampas, the artificial floating gardens of ancient Tenochtitlan, still exist in modified form in modern Mexico City's Xochimilco district, tourist attractions where visitors glide on colorful boats between flower-covered islands and seldom consider the darker history these waters conceal. But in 2015, during construction of a new subway line beneath the historic center of Mexico City, workers broke through into a sealed chamber that turned out to be part of the Temple Mayor complex, the Great Pyramid at the heart of the Aztec capital. What they found inside revolutionized our understanding of Aztec military culture and revealed a youth warrior tradition that combined floral symbolism with bloodshed in ways that seem almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. The chamber contained the skeletal remains of 47 individuals, all male, all aged between 11 and 17 based on dental development and epiphyseal fusion analysis. They were arranged in concentric circles around a central altar, each youth positioned as if kneeling in prayer, and each one bore evidence of having died from a precisely executed heart extraction, the ritual sacrifice for which the Aztecs are infamous. But these weren't random victims captured in war or purchased as slaves. These were elite youth warriors, members of a military society called the Quetzalcoatl, the Eagle Jaguar Brotherhood, identifiable by the distinctive jade and obsidian ornaments buried with them and by artistic depictions found on the chamber walls showing young warriors dressed in elaborate flower-adorned costumes, wielding wooden training weapons decorated with Rio blossoms. They were flower warriors, participants in the Zacatecutl, the Flower Wars, highly ritualized combats that were simultaneously military training, religious ceremony, and deadly serious conflict where young Aztec warriors earned their place in society or died trying. The concept of flower wars has puzzled historians since Spanish chroniclers first documented them in the 16th century. How could warfare be associated with something as delicate and beautiful as flowers? The answer lies in Aztec cosmology, where flowers represented both beauty and blood, life and death, the cyclical nature of existence that demanded constant sacrifice to maintain cosmic balance. The flower wars were fought between the Aztec Triple Alliance and neighboring city-states like Tlaxcala, Huejotzingo, and Cholula, but unlike wars of conquest, these conflicts had specific rules. They were scheduled in advance, fought in designated locations, and had as their primary objective not territorial gain but the capture of enemy warriors for sacrifice and the testing of young Aztec soldiers who needed to prove their worth before being accepted into adult military societies. The archaeological evidence from this chamber reveals just how central youth were to this system. The skeletal remains show these boys had undergone years of military training. Bone modifications include asymmetric arm development consistent with Machu Picchu practice, the obsidian-bladed wooden sword that was the Aztec warrior's primary weapon. Leg bones show characteristics associated with the constant running that was essential to Aztec military tactics, where infantry armies could cover remarkable distances at a pace that amazed Spanish conquistadors. Many show healed fractures and other injuries consistent with training combat, evidence they'd been practicing warfare with real contact for years before their final sacrifice. But here's what's remarkable. Almost all these boys also show signs of exceptional care and nutrition. Tooth enamel analysis reveals diets rich in maize, beans, chili peppers, tomatoes, and importantly, regular access to cacao and animal protein including turkey and dog meat, foods typically reserved for nobility and warriors. These boys were being invested in, maintained as valuable assets to society even as they were being prepared for potential sacrifice. Now, let's talk about what the flower wars actually entailed, because the reality is more complex than simply ritualized combat. Historical sources, primarily the works of Bernardino de Sahagun and Diego Duran, who interviewed Aztec survivors after the Spanish conquest, describe flower wars as highly organized events where young warriors, some as young as 12, would march to the agreed battlefield accompanied by veteran warriors who served as observers and judges but did not participate. The youths would engage in combat using macuahoodles and wooden spears, not with the intent to kill, which was considered wasteful, but to wound and capture. A warrior who successfully captured an enemy by subduing him without killing him earned prestige and honors. The captured warrior would be taken back to Tenochtitlan for eventual sacrifice, while the captor would advance in military rank and social status. For young Aztec warriors, success in flower wars was the primary path to social mobility and the avoidance of a life of agricultural labor or menial craft work.